we want to now bring in Susan Page. She is Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Good enough to join us today. Lots to get to, including some really fascinating polling done by your paper. But I want to get to first that response we heard from the president-elect yesterday regarding the aftermath of the Berlin attack and how it may inform his proposal, a cornerstone of his campaign, to ban all Muslims entering the country, to have a registry of Muslims. He said, and I quote, "You've known my plans all along, and I've proven to be 100% correct." So there is an element of plan and there's an element of self-congratulation. But what do you make of what he had to say?
So this is one of the problems when you have a tweet or a brief statement and not a follow-up question, because I don't think we know exactly what he means. He did propose in one of his most controversial and provocative statements a ban on all Muslims entering the United States, and suggested he would even have a registry of Muslims in this country. But toward the end of the campaign, he changed that and said it was extreme vetting, not based on religion. And so I think we don't know exactly what he means. What's clear is that we're going to have a different kind of foreign policy with this president, willing to label incidents as Islamic terrorism before law enforcement officials are there. This is going to be something that is something to watch when he is actually in a position to be running U.S. foreign policy.
Interesting for somebody who lauds himself as a builder of things. The lack of structural integrity when it comes to things like foreign policy are striking and seem to be striking even to those who voted for him. I refer to the polling, and again, this is one of the pieces of the USA Today Suffolk University poll. Half of his supporters say that if needed, he should just reverse all the positions he took on the campaign trail.
That's right. They won't hold it against him. 50% of the people who voted for him are prepared for him to reverse positions. Just 39% said no, he should really do what he said he was going to do.
Is this that whole serious, not literal thing, literal,
exactly.
not serious thing?
I think that's exactly right, that a lot of his supporters assumed he wasn't going to actually build a wall across the whole southern border, but they thought he would be pretty tough on illegal immigration. So, and it's something I think news coverage, and I fought myself for this, failed to understand during the campaign. This gives him some running room as president to make compromises or change positions and not be held to account by the people who voted for him.
You also asked in the polling about conflict of interest as new questions seem to surface every day. This feels like the new tax return, if you will. Carl Icahn now being put responsible for crafting regulations over his own industry. There was a quote in your paper that said essentially it was like asking a fox to guard the hen house. You could say that it feels of many of his appointments. What did the poll essentially, how do people feel about these rather apparent conflicts of interest?
So we found that a majority of Americans say Donald Trump has not done enough to address potential conflicts of interest. And here's what's interesting. That includes 19% of his own voters. So even people who supported him think you have to do more to distinguish between your business interests, your family's business interests, and the country's interests. And it seems to me that until he does that, he's going to face continuing questions about this.
And I suppose facing questions is one thing. Answering them very apparently and very fundamentally seems to be a completely different thing.
We still haven't had a news conference by the president-elect since he won. In fact, we haven't had a news conference since July. This is unprecedented in modern times, and a sign that this White House may be willing to handle press relations in a very different way from that we've become accustomed to.
I wonder if, too, recently, of course, there was a question about his adult sons participating in a post-inauguration fundraiser. It feels as though this administration feels very comfortable idling right against the line and essentially seeing how public opinion turns one way or the other.
No, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is this is a family that hasn't faced these issues before. You know, there are things that are perfectly appropriate to do when you're a business executive that are inappropriate to do when you are the son of the President of the United States. And I think that perhaps to some degree they're figuring out that things that they think shouldn't be controversial are quite controversial, and they've indicated on some of them, including coffee with Ivanka Trump, that they will step back if there is a reaction.
In talking about policy, then another thing that we heard, especially in the last months, the instant repealing and replacing of Obamacare. Your polling showed that people felt it was both the president's greatest success and greatest failure. We did hear Donald Trump in his interview in 60 Minutes immediately following his election seem to walk back some of his extreme positions regarding the Affordable Care Act. What to make then of the future, do you think, of this law?
You know, I think it is, we did hear the president say some interesting things about maybe you want to keep the provision that kept people from having pre-existing conditions that made it impossible for them to get health insurance, or keeping the provision that allowed young people up to age 26 to stay on their parents' plan, something I was personally grateful for when one of my kids got out of college and didn't have a job immediately. But this has been a cause for Republicans since the Affordable Care Act passed. And it is hard for me to imagine that Republicans in Congress are going to back away from a repeal of Obamacare, although what they may do is delay the repeal, the implementation of the repeal, for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to try to figure out what can go in its place to address some of the legitimate concerns, some of the legitimate problems that the Affordable Care Act has addressed.
We saw some happy times. We're here again between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump. It probably remains to be seen how long those happy times exist on this issue. Kellyanne Conway, again, there was questions about what role she might fill, a very ardent and rather ubiquitous surrogate for the president-elect. What do you make then of the idea of a counselor for the president and somebody who's going to be inside the West Wing?
You know, I talked to Kellyanne Conway about this last week. She said she was going to move to Washington. She was, in fact, in Washington looking for housing, thinking about where she'd send her kids to school. But she wasn't clear on whether she would be inside the White House or outside. You know, we expect there to be creation of an outside group that will help push Donald Trump's agenda. She thought she might be affiliated with that. But she also said that she'd do what Donald Trump wanted and that he liked having her around. You know, she is a pretty fierce defender, but there was a big incident, a big example of her willingness to push back when he was considering Mitt Romney for Secretary of State. You remember, she got way out there saying that would be a betrayal, basically.
Led the fight.
Led the fight against him and won. And that is a sign that maybe Donald Trump is willing to have people around him who will sometimes challenge him on issues.
I want to get you out of here on this one, if only because I can't decide what this says. When asked about issues that Donald Trump should address, create and preserve jobs, far and away number one. Almost half of those responding said that's number one. Fight terrorism and ISIS came in number two, roughly 15%, but also at roughly 15%. At number three, as we see here, drain the swamp, which one could argue doesn't really mean anything. One could also argue is exactly the opposite of that which we have seen thus far from this transition team. What do you make in number three here on the list?
I think drain the swamp is, in a way, the biggest reason Trump won an election. It's make a change. Things don't work. Shake them up. I think that's what drain the swamp means. And, you know, you look at the number of Goldman Sachs veterans in the cabinet, you think maybe that's not draining the swamp. But this is an issue on which Donald Trump is going to be judged. I think perhaps the most fundamental issue.
It's fascinating. I cannot recommend this polling enough. Susan Page, thank you so much, and happy holidays from all of us here at CBSN.
And to you too.